Okay, welcome back everyone. I thought for a moment there that Zoe was going to take the podium, but that was wishful thinking. She's back sitting down again. So, it's been such a busy day. I'm exhausted, I don't know about the rest of you, but so much inspiration and so much talking. I'm looking forward to a drink at the end of this. But for this final session of the afternoon, we're really delighted to welcome Sophie Howe, who is the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. And Sophie is going to, I think, give us all a bit of a call to action and a really useful sum up of a lot of what we've discussed and shared today. So I will, if you're ready, I'll pass over to Sophie and she can finish up the session. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be with you here this afternoon. I'm only sorry, having looked at your agenda, that I couldn't join you earlier on, because from what I can see that you've been discussing, it would feel very much like my kind of spiritual home, I think, spending the afternoon with you. Instead, I've been at a government review panel, first meeting of a review panel which is looking at the potential opportunities or potential challenges of automation and digital innovation. So there's an issue for us to be thinking about as well. And it's always encouraging when you come to things like this and you talk to people about the sorts of things that they've been discussing throughout the day, to see that actually they completely align with the stuff you'd already written down that you wanted to say. So that's good. So the words that I've seen writ large on the post-it notes so far, procurement is a big one, absolutely. Doing some work on procurement within my team and with the government. I saw the words down there, something like challenge business as usual, and that's absolutely something that I say in practically every speech that I give. If we're going to make this legislation work, we need to challenge business as usual. So for me, as Future Generations Commissioner, this event couldn't have come at a better time. Not only is it, I think, a hugely exciting time for the Swansea Bay City region, but it's a crucial time for Wales as a nation. Wales which wants to lead the way in terms of sustainable development, a Wales which has legislated to do that, not just in some aspirational policy document, but actually in law. We've said that we want to embed the principles of sustainable development. And I know that for many of you here in this room today, the ideas and the papers and the case studies you've shared are a culmination of a kind of lifetime's interest in this area of sustainability, and in particular the circular economy. And whilst I think it can be frustrating that the rest of the world takes it so long to catch up, I do believe that the time is now, because within this legislative context we do have the right environment to help us make the changes that I know that you want to see. And this is perhaps no better demonstrated than by the high-profile media campaign and government commitments to turn the tide on plastic. And finally, it seems that people with power are taking notice and taking action for future generations. These ideas that were so ardently pushed to the sidelines for decades by those who could profit from denying their significance are now fully within the mainstream. From the shocking images of Blue Planet 2, of decades-old plastic polluting our oceans, to June's edition of National Geographic. And perhaps you've seen this image, undoubtedly one of the most iconic images of the year, and I would argue probably a generation. As guest editor of this edition, long-time campaigner Ellen MacArthur puts forward a rallying cry for a circular economy, and she writes, "When you sail around the world, at times you can be 2,500 miles away from the nearest town. This brings an awareness that what you have on the boat is all you have. There is nothing more. You understand what finite means." And following her 2005 record-breaking circumnavigation, Ellen spent time researching the challenges facing the global economy. And she wrote, "I realise that my understanding of finite at sea is no different when applied to our planet's resources. These resources are available to us just once. Using them more sparingly and slowly merely delays the date we will exhaust them. We cannot continue in this linear fashion. And I couldn't agree with her more. We need to move beyond a culture of single use. All products and the materials we use to make them should be designed to be reused, recycled, or safely enter the environment. A few months back, I met a really interesting man, this man, whose name is Satish Kumar, and he is an environmentalist and a peace activist, and he's been taken up those roles for decades. And back in the 1960s, when he was a younger man, he sat in a cafe in Bangalore with his friend, and they were talking about the fact that long-term peace activist Bertrand Russell had been imprisoned. And they decided that they wanted to do something to support his action. They said, well, you know, he's an old man, we're young men, what can we do? And they decided that the thing they were going to do was they were going to embark on a peace walk. They were going to walk to every nuclear capital of the world, so to Russia, to Washington, to Paris and to London. And in doing that, when they got there, they were going to deliver a humble cup of peace tea. I guess the idea was that if people, our leaders, were thinking of pressing the button, they should do the very British thing of stop and have a cup of tea first before they took any such drastic action. But actually, you know, what he described is the fact that the journey itself became as important as the destination, because when they passed over land, across sea, and so on, he actually realised the connection that he had with the land. And the other thing was that they hadn't taken any money with them on this mission, so they had to rely on the land and they had to rely on the kindness of strangers. And that sort of journey and that connection between people and planet has formed the basis of his thinking and writings as an activist over many years. And he talks about the connection between the words economy and ecology. So they come from the same Greek root, oikos, which means home. The nomos part of economy means management, and the logos part of ecology means knowledge. And Kumar points out that you cannot have one without the other. He adds that without knowledge of our home, we cannot manage it, and so ecology has to come first. And I think that that's a message that we should all be thinking about, because quite simply, for too long, we have overlooked the World Bank. And I don't mean the one with the kind of capital letters and the global capital interest. I'm talking about the World Bank, our bank of assets, of resources for life. And realistically, we're using them at a much faster rate than we can replenish them. So currently, we need 1.5 Earths to be able to cope with our economic demands and insatiable need for growth. And I'll put it into financial terms. That's like always spending 50% more than you earn, going further and further into debt. But of course, with our World Bank, there is a finite supply of resources. And so what this means is essentially we're stealing from the future. We're borrowing more and more resources, but leaving little for future generations and leaving them to deal with the problems that we are amassing. And that's why we have such a vital opportunity here in Wales to rewrite the rules and challenges of what we accept as normal, what we're willing to leave behind for future generations, what we must leave behind for future generations. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is that opportunity, as I saw on the slide or on the post-its there, to challenge business as usual and to go beyond and think about the art of the possible. And I know that Jane talked to you about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act when she was here this morning. So we need to be thinking about how we can maximise, in everything we do, maximise our contribution to all of these 7 wellbeing goals, and using the 5 ways of working set out in the legislation to achieve them. So our legislation requires something which actually the minister who took the legislation through called it the Common Sense Act. Unfortunately, common sense is often one of our scarcest resources. You might think, why do we have to legislate for common sense? But there we are. So the common sense points or ways of working within this legislation is that here in Wales we must now plan for the long term and recognise the long-term impact of the things that we do. We must seek to shift our resources to prevention, so preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse. We must take an integrated approach, recognising the interconnection of the decisions we take amongst all of these 7 wellbeing goals. We must collaborate with each other within the public sector and crucially more broadly, because if we collaborate with the right people, and many of those right people will be in the room today, we have a far better chance of coming up with ideas and innovations and solutions to some of the issues that we face. And then finally, we must involve people. That's people like you, but it's also people who are in receipt of our services, because if we involve them from the start, we're much more likely to deliver policy and service that is fit for purpose. And as I said, the legislation also sets out these 7 wellbeing goals, which is a vision, I suppose, for the Wales we want. So together we're aspiring to a prosperous Wales with a secure and growing economy, a resilient Wales in which our ecosystems are protected and allowed to thrive, a healthier Wales where obesity and intergenerational health problems are overcome, a more equal Wales in which a child can hope to prosper and succeed no matter where they're born, a Wales of more cohesive communities in which we feel involved, engaged and supported, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and finally, a globally responsible Wales, outward-looking and forward-thinking, leading the way with regards to sustainable development and making a global impact in the right way, reducing our global impact in the other sense. So by working towards the goals, public bodies will be directly taking action on climate change and working towards a more resilient planet. Working towards prosperity, for example, should not be seen in juxtaposition to achieving a circular economy. And for me, this is reflected in the goals definition within the Act, the definition of a prosperous Wales. And I don't know if you can read this, but I'll read it out for you. So our definition puts low carbon front and centre of the economy that we want to develop here in Wales. So our definition, and as I said, this isn't just in some aspirational policy document, this is our definition of law of what we are trying to achieve here in Wales, is an innovative, productive and low carbon society which recognises the limits of the global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and which develops a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities. Now you'll see there that within that definition there's no mention of GVA or GDP. Crucially, this new definition shifts the emphasis away from measuring wealth in terms of how much money we have or we don't have, and across the globe it's being widely recognised by even some of the traditional global institutions such as the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, who are focusing more and more on this concept of inclusive growth. It is a concept that has kind of eluded us for very many decades, however. And alternative measures such as the Social Progress Index or measures on well-being or even the Happiness Index, which measures what matter, may have much more to tell us about whether or not we are moving towards an economy that delivers well-being for future generations. And the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is pioneering in the way that it allows for both the economy and our ecology to prosper. It recognising that prosperity is actually about all aspects of our lives, and we need to be moving towards that circular economy in order to secure the well-being of future generations. It's exactly why I intervened just over a year ago in the work surrounding the Cardiff Capital Region City deal, because as Guardian for Future Generations, I believe that we cannot be talking about a city region for the future which does not place low carbon at the very heart of its strategy. And it's why it's also important that we do what we can to ensure that those taking decisions on the tidal lagoon here in Swansea are applying the Future Generations Act. Now for some, that's a statutory duty for them to do so. Unfortunately, for the main decision maker, in this case the UK government, it's not. But I'd like to raise a question. I believe that we may be in a very different position now. The decision-making process might have been quicker, consider a broader range of issues and critically be looking to the long term if we had a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act across the UK, if there was that forethought in other parts of the United Kingdom. And it's quite interesting to see the sorts of decisions that are taken where we don't have these sorts of legislative levers. It's interesting to compare the delay and attitude towards the tidal lagoon with another energy project that the UK government recently approved, Hinkley Point in Somerset. Both schemes present an opportunity for a stable energy source and the projected costs of the nuclear power station are in the same range as the average long-term costs of the tidal lagoon scheme. And yet the UK government was keen to give the green light on one and does not seem to be keen or as keen on the other. We await the final decision there, I think, with our fingers crossed. And they say that the goods of today are the resources of tomorrow at yesterday's resource prices. So how can we be using the definitions within the Act to challenge the public sector? I'm sure that many of you here in this room have some brilliant things that you're doing, some brilliant things that you're trying to do, but often we meet with that kind of closed door where we try to engage with the public sector in that way with new ideas and innovative thinking, because it doesn't meet the way that we've always done things. I must say that there are some brilliant examples of where those sorts of things are starting to change. The fact that here in Swansea, the local authority are focusing on low carbon housing. The fact that, I can see Sally Atwood there from Public Health Wales, who's done some brilliant work in redefining the way that they procure goods and services in Public Health Wales. These are the sorts of people that we want to be encouraging and building up in terms of our public sector, and they will need your support to do that. So I've been very clear in terms of the legislation that it's not just another piece of legislation, that it has to be the catalyst for culture change throughout the public sector and for everything that we do here in Wales. Construction, infrastructure, transport, housing, the way we run our health services, the way we plan our towns and cities, the way we nurture our rural communities, energy generation and efficiency, the way we teach our children skills for the future. All of these areas have a really key role to play in reflecting the reality of the lives that people lead and communities that enhance the lives and well-being of everyone here in Wales today and for future generations in Wales. And the Constructing Excellence Wales model demonstrates how the principles of the circular economy can be applied to the sector to realise the potential benefits, turning theory into practical application. Their research has demonstrated a potential economic opportunity of an additional £1 billion per annum by 2035. This is an increase of 12.5% in turnover of the Welsh built environment sector and could generate 7,300 jobs. And the reality is that the circular economy makes sound business sense, and those companies realising that are those that are going to be staying ahead of the game. But this also applies and must apply to the thinking of the public sector. Those who are able to innovate and to respond to the challenge are those who are going to do very well in terms of meeting their obligations under the Act. I recently undertook an analysis of the 345 wellbeing objectives set by public bodies in Wales, and they've revealed some great examples of where new and innovative practice is taking place. Some of them are small scale. One of my particular favourites in terms of a small scale action is local authorities not cutting the grass. Instead, they're sowing wildflowers. That's really good for the environment, it's really good for pollinators that are on the decline, it's really good for communities because it looks beautiful, and you know what? It costs less money as well. So what is not to love? All it requires is some simple, small changes. Often they're driven by one passionate officer in a local authority or a health board or somewhere else, but we need to have more of those passionate people who are willing to think outside of the box. We also need people in our public sector to be thinking more broadly across all of their different organisations. Again, I've seen examples of in Cardiff where the new transportation strategy or plans for a new transportation strategy has been led in part by a public health professional. And that means that we're getting different outcomes than perhaps if we'd given that to be led by a transport engineer. So what we're seeing is a focus on clean air zones, we're seeing a congestion charge, we're seeing cycle superhighways, we're seeing ways of getting people active. And we need to see more of that type of thinking and planning together from across our public sector. But whilst my office is told on a daily basis about these inspiring and innovative examples of change, I think it would be unrealistic to say that we're completely there. We're on a long-term mission. People call it a journey, I call it an expedition, because actually what we're trying to achieve here is huge. We know where we want to get to, but like an expedition, I think we're going to encounter lots of challenges on the way, maybe an ice cap or two kind of hitting us on the head. but actually, you know, we need people to be resilient and brave in going forward with that expedition. It's about this long-term cultural change, rewriting the rules of a system where we've allowed business as usual to continue for such a long time, and so transformation isn't going to happen overnight. But both myself and the Auditor General for Wales, from the Wales Audit Office, who also has obligations under the legislation, are very clear. We've been very clear in our message last month that whilst we're still looking to support public bodies, they now need to become more ambitious, adventurous, and provide better clarity on how they're meeting their obligations under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. His words were that action now needs to match enthusiasm. I took a slightly different approach, talking about that classic Elvis Presley song, which actually I heard on the radio on the way up. A little less conversation, a little more action, please. And I think now is the time for that action from our public bodies. We know that the lives generations coming behind us will be very different to our own. We know that they will live in a world where artificial intelligence, robots and automation will change the way that they live and work, where the population will be bigger and older, where the climate will be hotter. But we need to be thinking about how we can do more to act today to set us on a course for the Wales that we want, rather than the Wales we'll get if we sit back and do nothing. And to create the right conditions to bring about the fundamental change we need, our leaders to be equipped for change and supported to change. We need to encourage thinking, which in many cases resists, particularly in the public sector, this magnetic draw we tend to create to doing things the way we've always done them, and to obsess about process over outcomes. We need to create the right conditions so our leaders are not just able to lead a service or an organisation, but are able to bring together and lead many services and organisations in a holistic way, recognising those interconnections between all of those goals. Our leaders need to be connected, not just to each other in the public sector, but to others where innovation are happening. They need to be connected to people like you, people who can help them deliver. And they also need to be connected, of course, to the people that they serve. We need to encourage risk-taking and a realisation that whilst trying something new may feel out of our comfort zone and risky, actually the biggest risk we face is continuing to do the same things that we've always done when we know that they don't work in terms of delivering the right outcomes for people. And we also need to be willing to question what those right outcomes are. An obsession with increasing GVA, for example, as being one of the main outcomes we want, without thinking about that in terms of whether it's shared equally, whether its achievement fundamentally damages the planet, or wait for it, whether it actually makes people happy. Now, we haven't yet got to quite an agreed way of how to measure this, although, as I said earlier, there's lots of work going on to try. But even so far, I think we're way off this being a kind of wishy-washy thing. Shouldn't it be the thing that what we strive to do here in Wales is to make people happy? And so leaders for the future, I think, will need to be willing to learn, to question and challenge. They will need to be willing to ask the what-if questions. They'll need to be asking the questions, the sorts of questions that you've been asking here today. What if we did things differently? What if it came to social housing? We focused on low-cost housing for students to increase the numbers who were able to go to university, and looked at combined arrangements which included volunteering with older people, helping to develop skills and education for those who might not otherwise be able to afford it, whilst also encouraging intergenerational relationships, sharing of skills, and decreasing the plight of loneliness. What if we looked to develop our apprenticeships in engineering for renewables, to develop community energy schemes? And we had a pipeline of this work because we were committed to ensuring all funded or owned buildings owned by the public sector were powered by renewable energy. What if we managed our uplands and agriculture differently to create jobs for the future around the management of land, focusing on protecting and enhancing nature, preventing flooding and growing sustainable food? What if we used this food in local schools and hospitals, and we banned all plastic cups and procured instead from local social enterprises, maybe who worked with people who had been long-term unemployed or people with disabilities, thereby developing a community enterprise hub that was powered by renewables, developed by the apprenticeships? What if we saw every pound we spent through public sector procurement, not as a spend, but as an investment in creating the Wales that we want to see? Now, a lot of things are happening. A lot of these things are happening in small pockets, but they're happening because there are innovators out there in our public sector and beyond, and there are people who are willing to embrace the spirit of the big and powerful innovators of the likes of Elon Musk and become constructive disruptors in their own organisations. It's an exciting time to live here in Swansea, and together with the world of academia, business, local authorities and private developers, I know that many of you are putting your heart and soul into making the right changes happen across the region. Whilst these are undoubtedly also quite uncertain times in terms of the future consequences of Brexit, devolved power and the questions around the tidal lagoon, we have an opportunity to say that this is the way that we're now going to do things in Wales. To move away, for example, from EU classification of waste and develop national strategy to decouple waste generation from economic growth and accelerate the transition to a circular economy. In reality, however, this shift cannot happen in a Welsh Government department, by one company, and especially not by one circular economy stalwart beating the drum for future generations but being ignored until it's too late. It requires a collaborative approach to creating a future with and for our future generations, and that's what I think you've started to do here today. Because in reality, we can do all of the complex modelling and planning that we like, but ultimately tackling climate change and moving towards the future we want will be driven by the behaviours of people like us. And I know in the conference today you've talked about those small changes that we can make. And every time I come to a conference, I think if I could find the capacity in my office to lead a piece of work which was on what we do, what we require conference facilities to provide in terms of no plastic and in terms of locally sourced food, and if everyone in the public sector and private sector beyond actually demanded that as a service, what difference could we make? If we did something like I saw when I sneaked away from a conference in Edinburgh the other day and found myself in a bar having a beer and chose the beer that was called the Brewgooder. It's called the Brewgooder because one item on that menu, the Brewgooder, all profits go to water aid in Africa. What if every public sector organisation demanded that in their hospitals, in their schools, in their conference facilities? What difference could we make here in Wales? So it is about the small changes, but it's also about the big changes. And I think both the small and the big are probably in the hands of you sitting here today. Thank you.